All right, guys. Looks like we're live. Thanks for joining us for our VR panel today. We'll try to get you out of here on or about the lunch hour. Hi, I'm Joel Espelin from the Diffusion Group. Happy to be with you guys. Got actually a great panel of folks who are really, I would say, working in the trenches of producing real VR. So that's going to be cool. We have Aswat Panda from LiveLike here in New York, Josh Courtney from Sky VR, who's also going to be keynoting tomorrow morning if you guys are still here, and Axel Piran from Video Stitch from France, also working in the VR space. So we'll get to our panels in just a second, but I thought, since you were all generous enough with your time to come here, I'd give you just a little bit of a highlight reel of a report that I just did on the future of VR. The one thing we're known for at the Diffusion Group is kind of doing these long-term forecasts. If you're ever familiar with our work at tdgresearch.com, if you're curious about it, or at tdgresearch on Twitter, we try to look way out, right? Not just cover the news of the day or this week's press release, but 10 years out is typical for us. So my new report goes out through 2025 and tries to give some view of how VR is going to happen. So I'm going to give you the quick highlight reel, and then we'll hopefully have an interesting conversation with these guys about how they're trying to make it happen today. Fair enough, everybody? So that's the Diffusion Group. So drivers and inhibitors we always look at when we look at a long-term trend. The big drivers of VR, I believe, are really personal viewing, youth culture, and the fact that VR is this cheap form of immersion, right? This is what separates it from 3D, which was kind of an expensive, crappy experience. VR is a really inexpensive, highly immersive experience. So I think that appeal to youth around the world is huge. The inhibitors, obviously today we have some social issues around strapping on the headset and some constraints around the use of VR in public. So there's some real constraints around this technology versus other things that have come before. As I often describe it, the iPod was cool, right? When you wore an iPod on the bus, it was a fashion statement. We're definitely not there with VR, right? If the guy next to you on the bus is wearing a VR headset today, he's a freak. He's not cool, right? So there's some public issues there. But overall, I think the positive is going to outweigh the negative over the longer run. I always like to show this slide when I introduce the topic of VR. And this doesn't have VR on here. But what it shows is that video as a whole is becoming a solitary medium, right? In other words, VR is not happening in a vacuum. All video is becoming solitary. And so this is our own proprietary research. The bar on the left is, do I watch by myself? The bar on the right is, do I watch with others? And what we see, first of all, is every single screen is a majority solitary medium at this point, every single screen. So I know we all like to have an Ozzie and Harriet view, sort of 1950s around the television view, but I think we all know that that's actually not the world we live in. And as we go to smaller and more personal screens, tablets and smartphones, overwhelmingly a personal experience. So what I always think is, just imagine VR as that next screen over on the right? It's really not, in a sense, that radical. It's just that next screen over on the right, which is a highly individual. You could be in there with other people in some kind of social avatar type context, but in terms of the viewing, it's clearly individual. This is our projections of sort of sales by demographic segment, and the thing I would point out here is that VR is definitely a demographic type of phenomenon. We see 18 to 24s, no surprise, as kind of early adopter-ish, but actually 25 to 44, kind of younger segment of that, being your dominant purchasers of VR. We don't see a lot of VR consumption, certainly in the early years, by kind of baby boomer types, and we even split the 25 to 44s, sort of older millennials, I guess the trailing end of Gen X, but really millennials, into an early adopter and early majority group. You also notice in this, we don't have kids up here. We usually project our stuff down to 12. There will be some teen users, but for purchase and other reasons. And we also think young kids are going to be a bit of a challenge early on, unlike video games. parents not necessarily that excited today about strapping a headset on, 4-year-old junior. So really what these guys, I think, are helping do right now is how do you build that global installed base? And so the one thing I would encourage anybody who's working with VR today is any medium that we've ever built, or any sort of new cultural form, whether it was video games, whether it was streaming video online, right, the internet itself, all these mediums took some time to have a gestation period. That's what we're doing over the next couple of years, building that base of kind of passionate early folks and getting to mass over the, in my numbers, by 2018, 26 million, 2019, 50, 100 in the 2020 type range. I'm pretty comfortable with that. In other words, this gets to be a big audience, but I think people who think that's going to happen, like that are kidding themselves. The absolute size of the U.S. market, I think the other thing that's different about this market is it's global from day one. Right? I think obviously some of the hottest markets for VR are going to be in Asia. So the U.S. market is going to be important. These guys, even here on our stage, we're going to talk about stuff that's going on in Europe and the U.S. So this is a market that's global from day one. The U.S. market is important, but I don't think this is we're not in 1985 where the U.S. is going to just carry this market all by itself. I think that's also not a good way to think about it. And so again, I don't think we should be too positive or too negative if we don't see massive sales in the U.S. of a particular headset model. All right, I think that's, again, too negative the other way. But we're going to get a U.S. market that's big enough to support VR content. Again, here, I feel like we get to 5 million maybe by the end of next year, 10 million-ish sometime, late 2018, early 2019, 20 million by 2020. By 2025, you're talking 80 million people in the U.S. So that's a big market in the U.S., and I can sort of support that demographically in a sense why it's not smaller, why it's not larger. Again, I don't think my mom's going to be strapping on a VR headset anytime soon, so I think there are age limitations for this medium, but we do think it gets to mass over time. Global, obviously even bigger, sort of 100 million by 2021, maybe 250 to 300 million by the end of this period. Again, that could be even conservative depending on how crazy you want to be about China, but certainly a large market. And again, we talked about US. So I wanted to throw this up quickly before we get to it. I love history of technology of all kinds. And so what I've put up are curves for VR US and VR global. The kind of blue here, the light blue is the US. That middle line is global. And compared to other technologies that have come before, the iPhone and the iPad are the big, huge numbers at the top. The Nintendo Wii is this guy in the middle. And down at the bottom, we have the original Atari 2600, the Walkman, and then that light blue is the iPod. So where does VR fit, right? And so I think it's important to realize, VR is not another iPhone. Right? I think that's not the proper frame or expectation to set on people in this industry. That's not a fair, sort of burden to bear for the baby VR industry. I think it's more like video games. I really do. I think if we look back at the history of video games was a completely new behavior, a completely new cultural form, a completely new hardware device you had to buy, sort of a completely new parental screen you had to go through for those who grew up with video games. And it took some time. Right? But the original, I think those who know history of technology, they also know Atari 2600 was a wildly successful product in its time in terms of a new product in a new category. So I think expecting VR to be that successful is reasonable. Obviously, we're in a more global market, so that's why I think VR in the US will perform similarly to some of those previous hit products. But global VR, we should think more about things like the Wii, right, which is a more modern era, new behavior, video console type product, and look at numbers like that. So where does that translate into household penetration? Up at the top here in our numbers, obviously kind of smartphones and PCs. Game consoles are basically flat. I'm not sure, sometimes folks seem to miss that point. But video game console penetration has been flat in the US for a very, very long time now. And then the internet set-top box category in the green continues to grow, and we believe it will sooner rather than later pass game consoles. So, VR, I think, is on a trajectory to head for video game console type penetration, ultimately, meaning households of younger adults, households with minor children, the same kind of households that have game consoles today. I don't see VR as an absolutely universal appliance in every single household in America. Again, I don't think that's a fair burden to put on VR, but most people would consider game consoles to be pretty mass market at this point as well. So again, I consider myself a VR realist. I'm not a skeptic, but I'm not as I call it, a Kool-Aid drinker either with respect to VR. But I think realistically, we can all realize this is going to be a really significant market a few years out. And obviously, the hardware is going to precede the content. We're about to get into that here, but obviously, you got to sell some headsets to people in order to have a market to sell content into. Pretty obvious, but I think is still going to cause some people some challenges over the next few years, right? As you're trying to offer services into a pretty small market. But over time, all these markets are the same. The hardware will commoditize, and the content will ultimately be where it's at, as obviously headset prices come down. So I'm going to jump into our topics here. Again, I don't think VR is going to take over all of TV, and I'll end with this one. It's a generational thing, right? I think you can build a big market here without having to expect a ton of VR viewing by baby boomers or a ton of viewing by real small kids. So the big bands in the middle for me are the 25 to 44s. The purple is the 18 to 24s. Here's kids at the bottom. So I don't think it's a kid-led market, which may be slightly different than original video games. That's, history rhymes, it doesn't repeat. So I don't think children actually lead this market. I think they follow, and the market sort of trickles down from teens and young adults slowly into, older teens, younger teens, and then tweens. I think it kind of goes that way, not the other way around. And I think sort of like, if your mom or grandparent is on Facebook, you know that technology trickles upwards as well, eventually as well, right? So we will see some boomers certainly play around with this technology as well as they see their kids and other younger adults use it. So that's my context. Hopefully, again, gives you a few takeaways, and questions welcome at the end. But now I want to turn to these gentlemen with a little bit of a frame and say, what are the biggest challenges you guys encounter right now in producing VR? First, why don't we just start it off, provide a real quick introduction of what your company does, and then sort of one recent VR project you've been working on. Let's just start it out easy.
Hey guys, so I'm Saswat from LiveLike VR. So what LiveLike does is we do virtual reality for live sports experiences. Unlike sort of the other traditional pure video sports, live streaming experiences for VR, what we focus on is the user experience. So we'll put users in sort of their own VIP suite at a live game that we can stream. It'll be like a 180 stream. And we'll have their friends there virtually with them in the same sort of experience regardless of where they're at. And then because we have sort of 3D environment around you, we can provide you with stats, augmentations, all sorts of stuff that makes the sports watching experience more immersive than just looking at pure video. And then one of the things that actually we've been doing a lot of different things with Sky in the UK, with Fox, and a couple other sort of broadcasters. Last event we did was a Premier League game this weekend, and then a NASCAR game with Fox the weekend before. And so right now, all of it has been kind of in the testing phase. We're hoping to start having a product with these guys in the next couple months.
Okay, great. So Josh?
Josh Courtney with SkyVR, and our focus is really around live television, broadcast, and the entertainment market. Doing a lot of work in the feature film world as well. Really we're in the live action side. We're working with, like guys like these guys that are actually, going in and bringing the graphic side and the interactivity and doing a lot of best of breed and best partnerships. We're also doing a lot of partnerships on the broadcast and the actual delivery of that medium as well. So our focus is really on providing an end-to-end solution on that VR side of actually being able to do something that fits into the broadcast and fits into the streaming markets. We feel like that's a really important thing for us to get right from the very beginning, rather than trying to push content really heavily. But there's a lot to do in that space, as well as in the streaming space, and obviously all the things to figure out in VR. But one of the other things that we're doing is also looking at kind of the camera side and how we actually build broadcast-ready VR cameras that can actually send signal and can be worked into trucks and switchers and all those types of things. So we can provide an actual holistic live television switchable experience that users used to seeing, but in a completely different format. So, and then one of the things that we just did was also some stuff with NASCAR at the Auto 400, as well as Fox with Daytona 500, and a few other things in that space, and now currently working on some stuff in the feature film side. So, some really cool stuff on that front, and also being able to work with Facebook and YouTube and those guys in their 360 products, and we really see those as kind of gateway drugs into virtual reality, and moving users kind of through that 360 into VR into more consistent VR broadcast experience. So,
all right, great. So quick, Axel.
So at Video Stitch, the history of Video Stitch coincides with the beginning of VR. So the founder had great difficulties doing the first stitched video. That was 5 years ago. It took 1 week to stitch 1 minute of video. That's what made him decide to create this company. So 3 years ago, Video Stitch launched the first video stitching software called Video Stitch Studio. Last year, we launched the first live stitching software called the HANA VR. And 3 weeks ago, we launched the first VR camera. So we are an enabler. Our goal is to make the content easier to create, cheaper to create, as you said. So I think we are getting there, because today making VR requires a lot of different skills, is very costly, and there is a lot of failure points. The aim of our company is to simplify this, and we work with our customers in order to make this happen. We have customers in every possible vertical, from broadcast industry. There are TV shows made with our software around the world. There are premium experiences created by cinematographers, short movies made with our software. So we also know that there are problems, there are issues. And we observe in Asia new types of VR, like in-venue VR. That's very exciting. Like you are at a venue and you can have a different point of view in the event in real time. So these are also things that start to become a market. Actually, it's very surprising how fast it is happening. It is at a small scale, but we provide the tools, and there is a lot of creativity, a lot of experiences going on, and we are very hopeful about the takeoff of this market this year.
Oh, great. So I think what we already see, is certainly sports being a big kind of enabler in the early days. I'm certainly a believer of that. The crossover with the same demographic, the crossover with kind of that gaming audience, I think is a really good one. And in terms of interesting things you can do. So let's just take it down. I know obviously at this show we tend to have a varied but often very video sophisticated and technical audience. Let's talk a little bit about what it takes today to do a VR event. I know you guys were just doing, as you said, some interesting things, both in auto racing, I guess, and in soccer or European football. Pick an event, maybe Josh, and you can start us off, and then feel free to add, Axel. What does it take? What does it take today?
Well, I think first and foremost, it takes production experience. I think one of the big things that we're seeing and hearing from customers all over the world is that they're hiring virtual reality companies right out of the gate that have no production experience. And so, they figured out VR, they figured out how to do some stitching, they figured out a few things, but then they go out and they quite literally, get there and go, okay, well, now what? Because they haven't done that. So I think, that's a really important piece. And I think that's an important thing to understand and to pay a lot of attention to, in the VR market. If you're going to produce virtual reality, it's not easier, it's harder, so you better know production up front, because you're going to have 10 times the production challenges trying to produce an event in virtual reality than you would in traditional TV. I mean, I would love to produce stuff and,
Right.
like going back to doing just regular TV would be awesome, because it would be so easy. The challenges around doing it with multiple cameras on a single site, where, you're in a traditional event like NASCAR, there's 300 cameras, right? Well, you're trying to cover the entire event in virtual reality with 4.
Right.
That's a lot of production to be able to know how to do. So you've got that side. I think one of the other real challenges is in the camera space. The cameras, you're really up against, a couple of different things, especially on the event side. A lot of the cameras right now, you can't sync shutter. You can't change your exposure, and you're moving back and forth. And a lot of times you're shooting something that's highly exposed on one side and shadow on the other side. So being able to actually have that control of a camera unit is a major deal. As well as being able to then transmit out of those cameras, then stitch it somewhere else. How are you handling that stitching? Those are a lot of the major challenges that are going on. And how do you do live stitching? How are we doing? We're working into hardware stitching now, and I think that's a very interesting thing of us, or not just us, but us as an industry of starting to look at from the broadcast side. How do you take those cameras and get that signal from half a mile away? And then what do you do with it? And then putting it into hardware stitchers and some software stitchers, and being able to then encode that, transcode it, and then get it back out to a customer. So there's some very interesting things going on that side, and I think that it creates some
Talk a
challenges.
bit, since you guys have been out at some of these events, talk a little bit about, in a sense, the cultural issue that goes on there in terms of their traditional broadcast truck versus sort of these guys trying to do new technologies and new angles. I know I was at an event in Las Vegas trying to cover a boxing match, and there were some VR cams set up that were super cool, and I actually observed in the truck, and it was very difficult to get any of that stuff on the air.
Right.
The director would tend to not take that feed for some of the reasons you're also talking
Right.
about it. Maybe it didn't look quite perfect, maybe the lighting, but there was almost this battle to actually get any of that stuff used. So maybe that was my perception, but there's got to be some cultural issues between the traditional guys and the VR guys.
There can be. I think that's where the production experience comes in. I think if you're working with vendors that have traditional production experience, I think you've got the opportunity to, know where those rules are, where those lines are that you don't cross from a production standpoint, and knowing how to go in and make those requests of where your camera placements are and all that stuff. I do think there's a high curiosity level. That's what we're seeing. I think the guys on the traditional side are going, hey, can I check that out? What's that look like? And I think it's a lot like, I did a lot of work in the transition over to HD, and so when the first HD guys showed up, with their cameras, the traditional guys were like, get out of here, and so they didn't want to have anything to do with it. Their stuff took up too much space. It was a very similar thing, I think. And so, I think as the market develops and as more production companies come online that have been doing it for a long time or are moving into that space and have that experience, I think that's going to even out. And I think that those are, I don't see it as an adversarial thing. I think it's an educational thing, and I think that if you can use it as that opportunity, and everybody kind of knows we're testing,
Right.
Especially this
Sure.
stage. The networks are testing, we're testing. We've done for the same client 3 jobs over 3 months, and every single time we show up, they're like, "What is this camera rig?" Because it changes. And it's like,
Right.
well, this is a version 4 of this camera rig, and we lost 20 pounds off of it. And they're like, "Oh, okay." So.
Right.
It's a constant evolution at this point.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. We're at the learning phase. In terms of LiveLike's perspective at some of these events you've been at recently?
I would kind of echo the same sort of points, but we actually approach it from the perspective of guys who come from a gaming sort of background with less experience on the production side. Fortunately, one of my co-founders actually studied production, although that's not something he did in the real world. And so when we first started this entire process, we actually started off with sort of standard production equipment. And one of the sort of value propositions we wanted to bring out was that we believed we could create a sort of better experience than what's out there using standard off-the-shelf equipment. And so what we do is that we actually use standard cameras. So it'll be like a Sony F55 Blackmagic, right? Just like a bunch of standard cameras on the production side, the encoders, the packaging system, the CDN, all of that. Pretty standard stuff, and we're basically transmitting like HD, like 1440p video, both H.264, H.265, over to our application. And our application, we only do 180 sort of, or 160 generally sort of like streaming. So what we do is we take standard cameras and we'll put like a wide angle, a fisheye lens on them. So if you're kind of, if you're talking about tennis and you're, behind the players, we'd use a lower, sort of lower FOV lens than if you're in soccer and the camera is kind of on the side of the field. We'll have sort of different lenses that we use. But the video delivery mechanism we use is kind of, standard out there, minus obviously the H.265 side of things. And so
but it's a great insight. You're saying that for everything, in particular for sports, you don't need 360. If I'm sitting, I don't really need the guy sitting in the row behind me if I'm at the 50-yard line of the football game.
Exactly,
Okay,
and
great.
I think just kind of, because we've come from the gaming space where for us, immersion is everything, and we kind of see that VR is a way to kind of like, exponentially increase the immersion you can have with whatever experience you're trying to deliver. So for us, we've realized that, even just using like standard video can actually provide a really, really strong, captivating experience. Kind of a separate note is like one of my favorite VR experiences is when I fly, I'll open up a movie theater and sit on a plane and just watch a movie in a giant screen, right? And it's, if you think about it, like there's infinite amounts of content you could actually do that with. Sure. So there's a Netflix app, there's a Hulu app, and all of that sort of stuff. So once you start seeing these like devices get lighter, the resolution start getting better, there's going to be no reason to watch any of these programs by yourself on a small screen when you can watch it and feel like you're...
Well, as I call it, it's kind of immersion in your backpack, right? That you can't put that huge plasma screen. What I call this hang on the wall is, that oftentimes the population for VR, not only do they not have a screen, they don't have a wall, right? So what they own is a backpack, right? So being able to put that screen in your backpack is compelling. Axel, could you talk just a little bit about your notion in stitching of also, are you trying to do some of these, because what you're almost talking about is a kind of almost, I would call it a simulated VR experience, or a VR light experience where you're taking something more resembling traditional video and making it VR-like. Are you seeing some of those use cases as well, Axel?
Well, we are an enabler, so we believe that immersion comes from having a 360 view of an event. That's it's a basic of our company. So what we observe, what is difficult in VR is that the user is free to watch the portion of the panorama that he wants. So he's not necessarily watching what you would like what you like any given person to watch.
Right.
From there, either you can decide to indeed create an environment so that you focus the attention of the person, or you can leave the person free to watch whatever he wants and create multiple points of view. That approach, having multiple points of view, it's necessary because there is, it's hard to focus, to maintain the pleasure of the user, the attention of the user for an hour with a single point of view. That's what we observe. Attention, the boredom comes, when there is nothing interesting at any given point. At some point you get bored. If you are watching your TV, the director would show you what is interesting, but otherwise you can get bored. To overcome this, one way is to have an environment, and the other is to have multiple cameras. And the other point you raise is that today it is hard to have many VR cameras. By making the process simpler, we make it possible to have more cameras on a venue, and we developed actually a camera called Aura that could help multiply the number of cameras on a given stage. It's very small, it can be put closer to the action, because there is also, with stitching, the main problem is the parallax. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but the bigger the distance between the cameras, and the longer, the bigger the zone where you will have stitching errors that are very hard to correct, because if you try to film, you can do the experience with your eye. You put your finger in front of your eye. There is some points that are hidden behind your finger. These points, because they are not seen by the computer, you cannot invent them. So we find ways to stitch this, and it's research intensive to improve it. So this is our approach. Now we think the future is a mix of an environment and multiple point of views.
Right. Well, and maybe that's the point I was getting at earlier a little bit, is in the traditional view, that director had a lot of control, right? That director in the truck had a huge amount of control. He's got all the cameras, he's got all the views, and he's trying to create a narrative in a sense, right, over a live experience. I think Axel makes an excellent point. Once you get to a small number of cameras where maybe you move some of that control to the user, you create something very different. Josh, what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, yes and no. I think that, over the last couple of years of doing this stuff, I think the what we call fly-on-the-wall VR experiences are going away. I think that, when we physically hand somebody a headset and show them a fly on the wall, they will watch about 30 seconds of it and then take it off and go, that's cool. And they don't necessarily go to the next one or the next one or the next one. I think that, our job from the entertainment side, or because that's what we do. I mean, we're entertainers, right? We're creating content. We're content creators that entertains people. We still have to tell a story, right? You can't get away from that story. Just because it's virtual reality, you can look wherever you want, doesn't mean that you stop having to tell the story. The story is still a very important piece. I think the director, that person's point of view, or that narrative that you're trying to create is very important, because just like in traditional TV, if you only stayed on one camera, you may not stick around that long as a viewer. If you can switch between 20 or 10, 20, 30, 40 cameras, you have a narrative, you have a view, and you have all the announcers and the voiceover and all that makes sense. The graphics make sense. The experience stuff makes sense. I think that when you build it, we're so early and we're so young in what we're doing. I mean, we're literally at like V1. This is all has just come out of test, right? So, you guys are building experience stuff. We're building production side stuff and broadcast, and you guys are building software. And it's, we're all kind of working together. All of us are kind of building our own little pieces, and some of us are starting to play together nicely in the sandbox and figure out how that works. And we're going out and reaching into the traditional broadcast world and trying to bring those guys into what we're doing. And, we're doing a lot of work with the guys at Viz right now, and it's super interesting.
Right. Hey, and I want to make sure we have time for questions as well. So we'll keep chatting, but if you have questions, feel free to jump in at this point. Yeah, right here in the front.
So I just have a question, because it seems like live VR is going to be more the fly on the wall, just because of the nature of it being live. And something that's in the can be asynchronous, because you can discover things. Mm-hmm. I see movies and productions being asynchronous, where, say you have a battle between the Americans and the Germans, World War II. You could have narratives that asynchronously you can experience something in a time, where the time isn't critical, in a live. Is that what you guys are seeing, or are you guys seeing
I think
a third way out too? I'm just curious.
I mean, I think that it's at the beginning of television, you would have probably said the exact same thing, because there wasn't the amount of content recorded in that format. I think one of the important things to do in VR is to make sure you're recording that VR feed. That every single one of those cameras, that stitch feed together, gets used, so that you can go back and then create asynchronous storylines. And so I think that market will mature over time as we go through, and it's important to make sure that you actually are archiving all your stuff. It's not just live and then gone. And not just live and stored online either. You should need to have that raw, piece.
Yeah, which does bring up a great point, though, because there's one thing I want to mention earlier, is kind of VR almost as a second screen or a super fan type experience. And maybe it jumps right off of that, Josh, is the notion of maybe you can share some of those different views online, on a feed, on a social network. Maybe maybe because everything, you're going to create some things that don't necessarily need to make it into whatever the main feed ends up being, but which are still really, really cool. That is actually what ended up happening at the boxing match I was at. The main use of it ended up being there was a lot of interest in it on social,
Right.
the stuff that didn't actually make it onto the NBC broadcast that night. So I don't know if you're
Behind
seeing
the
that
scenes
as
stuff,
well.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and then so with us, one of the things we've realized, similar sort of thing, is that TV production has kind of evolved over the last couple of decades to kind of tell a really strong, compelling story around what's going on in the game. If you have just a single camera, or in our case we have like 3 to 4 cameras that we'll place around the field, and just like Josh mentioned, we have all the same problems. If one camera goes down, we don't have a way to kind of prevent the viewer from kind of getting stuck in that sort of experience. So these are things that we kind of have to work towards. But the whole storytelling aspect of how you use VR content for telling that sort of compelling, strong story is going to take a couple of years, and we're all going to be working towards it to figure out what the best solution is. It'll probably end up being a very different solution from what TV is today. And for us, kind of an intermediary step that we use in our experience is we have multiple different camera angles, and you can jump between the different angles to get sort of that perspective. But at the same time, we use systems like the ORAD to actually augment TV screens, basically like a giant jumbotron onto the field as well. So whichever camera angle you're at, you can actually see like the whole TV feed with the TV commentary, which you can switch on and off as needed. And the advantage there is you're still getting sort of the experience that you'd get, the story you'd get from watching television, where you have a giant jumbotron up there. But in the case of NASCAR, for example, you're also sitting right next to the track, and every time the cars pass by, you kind of get that feeling as well.
Right.
So right now, that's our sort of approach to solving this problem, but it's something that's going to keep evolving over time.
I mean, one thing I'd encourage people to do, and I'll take a question and say it is, on YouTube, again, I'm a big history buff, is, look at some of the old live broadcast TV stuff on YouTube. I mean, I went back, and watched World Series from like 59, 60. It's unbelievable how different television live sports was done back then. And in a sense, how primitive, right, it really was, how incredibly primitive it was, and yet it was fine, right? So the storytelling medium obviously has evolved dramatically. It hasn't been a static medium either, even in that space. So did we have a question?
Yeah, Phoebe Conley from the Washington Post. I'm curious, even as you guys were talking, and it's a debate that happens in our newsroom, this panel sort of elided the difference between 360 video and VR. Do you think that's an important distinction to keep, or at this point, is it all VR?
I think my personal opinion is that all should be VR. There are 360 vendors out there that don't do VR, which blows my mind because I think they're missing a huge next piece, but that's just me. Oops. I think it should all be one and the same. I think that the 360 video is that's the universally accessible, especially as browser plugins and all those pieces. It's that accessible piece, especially from the news side. I think that virtual reality has an unbelievable opportunity to affect how we perceive news. The ability to not just see a third party, war correspondent talking about the war, but to be able to stand in the middle of a battlefield with them and have them guide you through that experience, I think can change the world's perception of what that means. I think that there's an unbelievable power in that ability to put the user there. I think one really important distinction, and this is going to be in the keynote tomorrow too, is that TV's been the same. It's the same format. We changed the size of the square, but it's still a square. Right. Virtual reality is a totally different format, and also there's a really big difference between watching television. Television is a third-person passive, kind of experience, right? You are arm's length distance away from it. Virtual reality is a first-person experience, and that's something that we all have to really wrap our heads around, because the storytelling changes, the perception changes, the way that you interact with the audience. It's a one-to-one, right? Traditional TV is one-to-many interaction. One-to-one. When that person effectively in that viewing experience is standing with you in the news field, you're going to talk to them a lot different.
Right.
You know, and you can talk to that person as a one-to-one, and then the ability to then have that large audience, could be 20 million people feeling like they're having a one-on-one conversation with someone.
Yeah, I
You
would
know,
think
there's
that,
an amazing power in
you know,
that.
I would think the delta, you know, again, I would look at this, if you look at how color television changed the coverage of the Vietnam War. I mean, and
Right.
back then that
Absolutely
almost was
right.
VR, right?
Yeah.
Because compared to what had ever been
Yep.
done with war coverage before that, that essentially was a huge stair step. I think you're going to see that kind of stair step again in terms of when you put people in scenarios. They've already seen it, right, in refugee camps and
Yep.
stuff, right? That, I mean, studies have already shown, right? VR is an incredible sort of empathy engine, particularly in early days. What I don't know is, for a generation raised on VR, maybe that'll become, you know, sort of blasé and it will wear off. But I think, particularly for a generation raised on television, VR is a super intense
Yep.
experience, no
Absolutely.
doubt. Any closing thoughts, or we have someone with a question, please?
Yeah, just one more. This is really exciting, and thanks for the insight you've given. In the testing and trials that you've done, has there been any noticeable potential impact to the network, i.e. the multi-camera stitched stream that is created? Is that noticeably different from a traditional stream? Are we projecting, are we going to be making the live peaks peakier, essentially?
In other words, views in terms of pure traffic bandwidth, are we
Yeah.
going to, you know, need fatter pipes basically to
Yeah,
shove-
we are. I mean, here's the reality on VR, right? The baseline file size, the baseline that you can put into a VR headset that is acceptable to look at and not want to take the headset off and throw it across the room, is 4K, right? And so we're not talking about 4K as something that may happen in the future. In the virtual reality side, it is mandatory, and that's where we start. And it's still blurry. Right. And so we're looking at, I mean, we're working on workflows right now in the encoding side that are 8K and 16K and trying to figure out how to encode all of that, right? And I know that
But
makes...
Josh, are you looking right now today, is that like a 25 meg stream, or just can you translate it for folks in this room for a 4K stream, or like how huge are you talking?
For a 4K stream, we're actually trying to target 7.
Oh, get it down to 7.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I don't think that 15 is realistic for a mass distribution. I think that it will chug out, and I think
Sure.
it'll buffer forever, and I don't think
Right.
that it'll be a good user
Right,
experience.
so you're trying to get it down to 7.
Yeah, I think that between 5 and 7, I think that there's a lot of work to do in that market.
Yeah.
We have a whole separate company that's doing just that.
Right. And I'm assuming that's HEVC you're talking to get it down into that? You're not?
No, I don't think I think that HAVC will get there eventually, but I think it's years away from making it there.
Okay,
I
so
think
today
that-
you're trying to do that with AVC?
And some of our own proprietary
some of
stuff.
your own stuff.
But I think that there's a lot of us that are working on, like, okay, chuck all of that. How do we rebuild the medium? Because all of those codecs came out of traditional, right? They're not part of.
Right.
They're not built specific for kind of what the new paradigm
Right.
is. And I think even in the 4K market, we're all just trying to shove more data through the same
Right.
pipe, and it's only going to go down so far before
Right.
it just chokes out.
Right.
You know, so yes and no. I mean, there's.
Right.
I think time and technology will help.
You want to
with
add
that.
something there, Axel? Just the last
Yes, I'd like to say that yes, we have a research team quite strong, and we have some civilian and military applications for what we do at over 10K. But as far as the market today is concerned, and the people in this room are concerned, I believe, you are limited by this, and this can decode 4K at 30 frames per second. So this is within these limits that we have to be able, all of us, to propose a compelling experience. And something that has not been mentioned, we mentioned video, we are video guys, but sound is extremely important.
Yeah, very.
Ambisonic sound is as important as video, and once this is tackled, and we are working hard on it, especially with our camera, we will make the content much more compelling than it is perhaps or was until today.
And I think there's going to be a whole panel just on audio for folks who definitely have that. But I appreciate, yeah, you're absolutely right about that.
Very true.
I know we're actually a little bit over. Feel free to come up afterwards with questions. Hopefully this has whet your appetite for VR. Thanks for the great contributions, guys.